Well, good evening, brothers and sisters, and welcome to this segment of the Laguna Niguel Stake's Living Faith Discussions with our very special guest, Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat. We appreciate you being with us this evening, whether you're on YouTube or whether you're following us on Zoom. And we want to thank all those who have worked so hard behind the scenes to make this possible this evening. Especially, we want to thank Mike Nielsen for all of his work to allow us to meet virtually this evening. My name is Brett Bryan. I'm from the Stake Sunday School, and I'll be conducting this evening. Presiding will be our Stake President, President Evanson. We will go ahead and begin this evening's discussion with an opening prayer by Sister Elaine Smith.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this great opportunity which we have to gather across distances together to learn and to grow closer to Thee. We're so grateful for our Savior Jesus Christ and the power and light He brings into our life. We thank Thee for the restoration of the gospel. We're thankful for this opportunity to have to hear from Brother Dirkmaat, and we pray that Thy Spirit will be with him, that he'll be able to present those things he's prepared well, and bless our hearts and our minds to be open to learn. And we pray for a witness of the restoration of the gospel and of Jesus Christ as Thy Son. And we pray that there will be no technical difficulties and that those who would like to attend tonight will be able to do so. And we pray for these things in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Smith. Well, this evening we're very privileged to have with us Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat, a professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. This evening, Professor Dirkmaat will be speaking with us about the translation of the Book of Mormon. He will speak to us for about 45 minutes or so, and at the conclusion of his remarks, there will be a brief question and answer session. So the way this works is if you have any questions at any point throughout the discussion this evening, feel free to do that. It's got to be on Zoom through the question and answer function. So if you have a question anytime this evening, please go ahead and do that. And at the end, President Evanson will moderate that question and answer session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time permits. At the conclusion of Professor Dirkmaat's remarks in the question and answer session, our closing prayer will be offered by Brother Ryan Smart. Well, by way of introduction, Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat is an associate professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. He received his PhD in American history from the University of Colorado in 2010, where he studied 19th century American expansion and foreign relations. His dissertation was titled Enemies, Foreign and Domestic, U.S. Relations with Mormons in the U.S. Empire in North America, 1844 to 1854. He worked as a historian and writer for the Church History Department from 2010 to 2014 with the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He is the co-author of From Darkness Unto Light, Joseph Smith's translation and publication of the Book of Mormon. He is also author of several award-winning articles on Latter-day Saint history. Prior to his work at the Church History Department, he served as the senior editor of Diplomatic History from 2003 to 2009. He currently serves as editor of the academic journal Latter-day Saint Historical Studies and is co-research director for the Religious Studies Center. He's working as an editor and historian of Brigham Young papers for the Brigham Young Center Foundation to publish and annotate Brigham Young's journals. He and his wife, Angela, have 4 children. Brother Dirkmaat, we're very privileged to have you with us this evening, and we will turn the time over to you.
Thank you very much, brother. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully we get that up so everyone can. Okay, I really appreciate all of you who are taking time to talk about this topic. Obviously, it's something that I care a lot about, and so hopefully I'm able to convey that to everyone. This image here is an image of the characters that were believed to have been drawn off the gold plates. For a long time, people thought this was the actual document that was taken to Charles Anthon, where they showed him the characters, and he said, "Oh, they're Chaldaic and Assyric." We know now that it's actually a document created a little bit later, because we think this is John Whitmer's handwriting here at the top, where he spelled characters in the fun way that he has. But you can see already the problem with the trying to figure out how we get the Book of Mormon that we have today, is that these characters obviously are not legible or readable to us. You can see some repeating characters. You can see, an upside down birthday cake, upside down birthday cake, upside down birthday cake. I don't know what that, maybe that's, and it came to pass, I don't know. But you also have, these backwards fish heads, giant H's. There's some repeating characters, but there's no way to read them. And the miracle of the translation of the Book of Mormon is one of those things that I think most members of the church, they certainly accept that this is a translation that's from the power of God. But sometimes the mechanics or the details surrounding how that translation took place are a little bit less understood. One of the reasons why it's been a little bit less understood is that some of our sources that help us understand how that translation took place are relatively recent, meaning there are some sources that existed for a long time, but that people didn't know where they were, or they hadn't been discovered. In some cases, they were discovered by researchers that weren't searching for Latter-day Saint history. One of the sources I'll show you later is a source from someone who was researching Shakers, and they just so happened upon a Shaker journal from 1830. And this Shaker writes in his journal about his encounter with Oliver Cowdery when Oliver Cowdery was preaching about the Book of Mormon in 1830, when he was on his way to present-day Kansas to preach to the Native Americans. And so that's kind of how historians expect history to go. We know that we're limited by whatever sources we have, but you also have to expect that over the course of time, sources your understanding is going to change as you get more sources. So how do we get the Book of Mormon characters from the unreadable to the manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which here are a couple different pages of this is the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon here. We have a general idea of how the plates went and how the translation occurred, but I think for most people, it's more a question of what is actually going on there in the translation. This is just a picture of the Hill Cumorah where Moroni had deposited the plates, where Joseph is led by the angel. One of the things that's very difficult for us to do as moderns, right, as people living in the 21st century, is it's really hard to put ourselves back into the shoes of the people who lived before. I think about this a lot when we're thinking about Joseph Smith's early trials that he has when he's getting the plates, and when he's trying to figure out how exactly God expects him to translate them and bring them forth to the whole world. For us, we already kind of know the end of the story. For us, we know he's going to get the book out and we're all going to be benefited by it. But for Joseph, he doesn't know. And in fact, some of these very big trials that occur to Joseph while he's trying to translate the Book of Mormon, they are even more poignant and difficult for him, because he doesn't have a knowledge of the plan of salvation yet, because he hasn't translated the Book of Mormon yet. So when his infant son dies in the midst of the translation process, he doesn't know yet the things that he would later come to know, both through the translation of the Book of Mormon and the revelations that we all hopefully don't, but I know I sometimes take for granted. So it's important that we recognize first and foremost that the starting point for Joseph Smith is he doesn't have any of the religious knowledge that most of us have when it surrounds our purpose in this life, the pre-existence, and he certainly doesn't know the end from the beginning like we do. We might all know that when those 116 pages are stolen, that don't worry, God's already got a plan for that. Well, Joseph doesn't know that. He knows that he'd promised God that he would take care of them, and now that they're gone. And so hopefully as we talk about this, you can have that in mind, that Joseph is starting from the very beginning. God has only told him a little bit at a time. This is an artist's depiction of Joseph receiving the plates. We know that it took Joseph quite some time to be able to get the plates, right? He has these multiple visitations with Moroni at first, and when he goes to get them, goes to take the plates, he's unable to take them. He explains it's because in his mind, he still had that thought that he might be able to get gain from them. Joseph's family is incredibly destitute. I mean, they're poor. They are going to have financial troubles all throughout the time that he's translating the Book of Mormon. And that was that first thought that was on his mind, that, there's gold in that box, right? And so it's going to take him a course of time. It's going to take him 4 years before he gets them. And when he finally does, he now has to go through that process of the translation. Now, when Joseph Smith described the translation to the world, he, knowing the Wentworth letter he expected was going to be published in a publication to the world, it ended up not being, and then they had to publish it themselves in the Times and Seasons. But this is how he described it. With the records was found a curious instrument, which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. This is pretty much all that Joseph will give us directly. He'll say something very similar in Joseph Smith history, that through the means of these stones, through the Urim and Thummim, he translated the record by the gift and power of God. This is certainly something that you know from Joseph Smith history in your Pearl of Great Price, that this is what the angel reiterates to him, that there were 2 stones and silver bows, and these stones fastened to a breastplate constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim deposited with the plates. And the possession and use of these stones were what constituted seers in ancient or former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. So both from Joseph Smith and the Wentworth letter, and from Joseph Smith history, which is in our canonized scriptures, we should expect, even if we don't understand all the mechanics of how the Book of Mormon is translated, we should certainly expect that there are stones involved in this process. That's what the angel says. It's what Joseph said. And yet sometimes we don't picture it that way. Multiple artists have attempted to depict the translation of the Book of Mormon. This is one of the more popular depictions of it. If I were in a classroom setting, or even if we were in the chapel together, I'd ask you all, what is missing from this picture? If we just read that the angel said that that God had prepared these stones for the translation, and if Joseph said it's through the Urim and Thummim that he translated the gold plates, well, as you can see there in this picture, there's not a whole lot of seer stones, at least that you can see. Maybe there's one that's in his hand and you just can't see it. The only other stones are the fireplace stones, so I'm not exactly sure those are it, right? I mean, you certainly can't see a visual representation of it. You do have an emotional response to the image, right? You see the reality of the plates, Joseph's hands on the plates, the light is illuminating the manuscript. Everything about this says that it's from God. But for Latter-day Saints, many of us are very literal when it comes to our art. We expect that an image that we see is more like a photograph than an artist attempting to convey something to us. You could look at another popular image of the translation. Once again, right here, we see a similar problem, right? Where exactly are the seer stones that the angel told him he would translate the Book of Mormon with? Once again, the artist is using light to bring your eye to the gold plates. You can see it glinting off the plates. Plates are real. You get that, right? This is something that is real. But it may not be conveying to us exactly how the plates were translated. No doubt Joseph did study the gold plates with his hands on them like that. We know he copied characters off the plates. We just looked at that image. But the artist here is not attempting to depict exactly how the plates were translated. This is actually really common in art. Again, sometimes we just don't generally think of it that way. If I asked each of you to picture George Washington in your mind, most of you would have this image in your mind. Most of you would picture this. Now, only because, we're Latter-day Saints, some of you would also have this one, right? That this is a favorite Latter-day Saint image of George Washington. But this one, that Washington crossing the Delaware, this is the iconic image of the entire Revolution. And we see this, we have that kind of emotional response the artist wants, but do we think that this is exactly how Washington crossed the Delaware? Hopefully we don't. Or if we went and read a couple of books, we'd realize that it wasn't the case. And there's all kinds of details that are different. For instance, they use high-sided iron ore hauling rafts so that they could easier hide themselves in it. They're so worried of being spotted by sentries on the other side that they lay down in the boats. They take cotton and they wrap the cotton batting around the oars so that the oars don't make a sound as they splash in and up and out of the water. Because they know if they're sighted on the other side that they're sitting ducks to cannon fire and rifle fire from the British and Hessian sentries. Well, one of the most obvious aspects of this that is very inaccurate is that they cross in the dead of night, and they deliberately cross when there's no moon, when it's very dark, so that they can't be seen. And here, you can imagine though, how does an artist show you Washington crossing the Delaware in pitch blackness, right? If it's just a black, canvas, then you might say, well, it's very abstract art, Washington crossing the Delaware. And do we really think that Washington, while all of his men are laying down, said, nope, this is for posterity, stood up on the prow of the ship and said, I don't care if they see me, I need this painting to look good, right? The point is, the artist never intended to show us exactly how the crossing of the Delaware took place, even though that's the first image that comes to our mind, because images are powerful. So sometimes it's important, especially when we're dealing with things like the translation, to unpack what our sources say happened, as opposed to ways that it's been depicted in art in visual ways. I could give you another example. I could ask you all to envision Moses right now. Just think about Moses in your mind. My guess is almost all of you have him wearing this red robe and black stripe going down the side, right? This is how Moses is featured in the art of many major religions at this point. This is not just simply Latter-day Saint art that depicts Moses like this. In fact, every image of Moses in the 20th century that I know of, that's at least in the United States, has him depicted in this kind of reddish robe with a black stripe going down it. Is it because in the Bible it says Moses wore a red robe with a black stripe going down? No, it's because Charlton Heston wore it when Cecil B. DeMille created the Ten Commandments, the movie 10 Commandments. That portrayal, you can even see what the artist's portrayal of Moses is kind of Charlton Heston, right? It's because that was such an iconic role that the idea inside everyone's mind of Moses was essentially Charlton Heston wearing this robe, who he's just wearing that robe as a way to set him apart from the rest of the Israelites. It's not biblical about it at all. It's for the movie's sake. But that's how we envision it in our mind. And so artists are always, they're confronted with a problem of what is the image I'm trying to convey. I can show an image that people aren't expecting, but then I'd have to have some kind of explanation of what it is they're seeing. And it might be more accurate, but they won't even know what it is. Or I can show them, I can do what I want them to do. I can get them to have an emotional response with what it is they are comfortable with. Rarely are artists attempting to be as historically accurate as possible. I mean, sometimes they try, but anyway, we'll move on from that. I just want you to have that in your mind. We know that the stones were involved in the translation because the angel tells Joseph that. Joseph tells us that. We don't know exactly what they look like, but we have some descriptions. They're variously described, the two stones that are found with the plates. They're described as crystals, they're described as diamonds, they're described as translucent, they're described as transparent, they're described as white. You can kind of get the idea here, a general idea that they are not quite totally clear, glass-like, crystal-like, diamond-like looking substance, but from the various sources that we have. So what could we know about the translation of the Book of Mormon and the devices that were used to translate it if all we had was Joseph Smith history in the Book of Mormon? Well, first, we just read the angel saying that he would use these stones to translate the book. But we also have some internal evidences from the Book of Mormon itself. When the brother of Gerrit is given his great vision, he's also given these interpreters. You shall write them and shall seal them up that no one can interpret them, for you shall write them in a language that they cannot be read. And behold, these two stones will I give unto thee, and ye shall seal them up also with the things which ye shall write. For behold, the language ye shall write I have confounded, wherefore I will cause in my own due time that these stones shall magnify to the eyes of men these things which ye shall write. If you drop down to verse 28, it references again, they'll seal up these two stones. That's not the only place a translation device is mentioned. They're mentioned again, the mechanics of translation are mentioned again with the story of Ammon and the people of Limhi. Now, this isn't, well known, I chop everyone's arms off Ammon, every primary child's favorite story of Ammon. This is the Ammon who finds the people of Limhi, who are the people of Noah. They at first arrest him and think that he's one of these evil priests of Noah that have been working with the Lamanites. When they find out that he's actually from Zarahemla, they're shocked because they thought Zarahemla had been destroyed. They'd sent out people to search and they found the ruins of what they thought was Zarahemla. It was actually the Jaredite civilization, and they found those gold plates. And as soon as Limhi realizes that who it is that he's talking to, that he's talking to someone from Zarahemla, he's not talking to an evil priest. This is the question he asks: knowest thou of anyone that can translate? And the response that Ammon gives him explains how this translation of ancient records was done. I can assuredly tell thee, O king, of a man that can translate the records, for he has wherewith he can look and translate records that are of ancient date. And it is a gift from God. And the things are called interpreters, and no man can look in them except he be commanded, lest he should look for that which he ought not, and he should perish. And whosoever is commanded to look in them, the same is called a seer. So the second thing that the Book of Mormon teaches us about this translation of ancient records with these interpreters is that apparently you're going to interact with them, right? He has wherewith he can look and translate records which are of ancient date. That means he's not just simply, taking the Urim and Thummim stones and, putting them in his pocket. He is apparently in some way going to interact with them. And we actually see that translation in process later in Mosiah. He took the records which were engraven upon the plates of brass and the plates of Nephi, and all the things been kept and preserved according to the commandments of God. After having translated and caused to be written, the records which were on the plates of gold, which had been found by the people of Limhi, which were delivered unto him by the hand of Limhi. And this he did because of the great anxiety of his people, for they were desirous beyond measure to know concerning the people who had been destroyed. And now he translated them by the means of these two stones, which were fastened to the two ends of a bow. Now these things were prepared from the beginning. That explanation, right, of how these stones are going to be used, that he used them to translate these unintelligible records otherwise. And as he said, he looks at them, at these stones, and that's how he's able to translate them. But that's not the only place that translation or the translation of the gold plates is mentioned. A similar question is asked later in Alma. How are these things, when are these things going to be brought forth? And the response from the Lord is, and the Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant. I don't know how to say this word because I don't speak ancient Nephite. I don't know very many people who do, but either Gazelum or Gazelum. I've heard people say this word multiple times, but I'll prepare unto my servant Gazelum a stone, which shall shine forth in darkness unto light. So how are these things going to come forth? Here you have the Lord referencing a separate device. So you have these two interpreters that are mentioned in Ether. You have them mentioned again in Mosiah. Here you have a single stone that's being referenced, and it even has a name, Gazelum. Now that's in the Book of Mormon. There are probably some of you watching tonight who are like, I don't ever remember reading that. I read the Book of Mormon several times when I undertook the study of early church history, and I never remembered having read that either, but you can go check it. I'm not just writing my own Book of Mormon. And so what could we get from just studying the Book of Mormon pages in the words of Moroni? First of all, that the translation was going to be done by the means of these special sacred stones that God had provided for, he'd prepared for the translation. Second, that the way that the translator, Joseph Smith, was going to use those stones is he was going to interact with them in some way. He was going to look at them. Third, that there are actually at least 2 separate translation devices that will be a part of the translation of the gold plates. The 2 stones that are bound together and this separate stone that's called gazelum. Now, this stone was, this separate seer stone was well known and discussed by other early prophets. And in fact, Wilford Woodruff explains that the seer stone known as gazelum was shown of the Lord to the prophet Joseph to be some 30 feet under the ground, which he obtained by digging under the pretense of excavating for a well. And pretty remarkably, when they were dedicating the Manti Temple in 1888, this is what he wrote in his journal, that he consecrated upon the altar the seer stone that Joseph Smith found by revelation some 30 feet under the earth. So Wilford Woodruff not only knows about this separate seer stone, he sees it as such a holy artifact, relic, that he's going to put it on the altar in the temple when it's being dedicated and consecrates that seer stone. He, of course, had actually seen the seer stones much earlier, back in December of 1841. Joseph had still shown him the seer stone. And so I think Wilford Woodruff has a special connection to that. At any rate, those are some conclusions we might draw before we go to any of the witness accounts of translation. And we'll go over some of those. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. First and foremost, before I get into more of these discussions, it's important to know that as a historian, I can only report what it is that people said. The translation of the Book of Mormon is a miracle from God. You can't describe exactly how a miracle takes place any more than I can describe to you exactly how the resurrection took place. I can tell you what resurrection is, but I can't tell you how it is. I can tell you that Jesus walked on water. I can't tell you how, right? And so as we relate what these witnesses and scribes of the Book of Mormon translation saw and what they experienced, if you feel like that you think it happened a different way, I mean, look, that's fine. I'm only relating what it is that our historical sources say, so that you can understand where different accounts of the translation come from. Early on, the terminology used for those stones that were found with the plates, those 2 stones that were bound together, is primarily interpreters, stones, or what Joseph uses most often is the term spectacles. This is from his earliest history. I know that Dr. Harper talked with you about this in your last meeting, his 1832 history. He's talking about Martin Harris coming back. He returned, and I said, I am not learned, but the Lord had prepared spectacles for to read the book, wherefore I commenced translating the characters. Sometimes people have thought that meant that he put the Urim and Thummim glasses on and wore them around like that. We don't have any accounts of that. I think he's just trying to describe that the closest thing they look at like is a pair of spectacles, but by every explanation much larger. This is one of our earliest accounts. Like I said, this was found only recently in a Shaker's journal. The engraving being unintelligible to the learned and unlearned, there's said to have been in the box and the plates 2 transparent stones in the form of spectacles. So again, the form spectacles doesn't mean that they are worn that way. Which the translator looked on the engraving and afterwards put his face into a hat, and the interpretation then flowed into his mind, which he uttered to the amanuensis, that's your $20,000 word of the week. Try to work amanuensis into your casual conversation. The scribe, if you want to put it that way, who wrote it down. Joseph Knight Sr., who was one of the few people who believed Joseph in the early days, before there was a church, when Joseph was just trying to translate, he's one of the ones who aided the translation by bringing food down to Joseph. He said that Joseph would, quote, put the Urim and Thummim into his hat and darkened his eyes. A sentence would appear in bright Roman letters, and then he would tell the writer, and he would write it down, and that would go away, and the next sentence would come, and so on. And then in probably the greatest irony of all 19th century writing, he added, but if it was not spelt right, one has no idea how Joseph Knight would know whether or not it was spelt right. But if it was not spelt right, it would not go away till it was right. Here you again have this second reference to the idea of Joseph using a hat in connection with the stones. But notice he explains why. Why? So he can darken his eyes. If we go back to Alma 37, it says that God will cause this stone gazelum to shine from darkness unto light. And we'll have some other sources that suggest that the way that Joseph is able to read what appears on the stone is he has to make it dark enough around the stone. It's kind of a conundrum, right? If you make the room completely dark, well, then Oliver Cowdery can't see to write. If you make it really light, then Joseph can't see what's on the stone. So what's an easier way to do it? To put the stone in a hat, and then you can close and open the brim of a hat so you can see the words as they appear on the stone. So it's not a magic hat, right? It's not Frosty the Snowman's hat. You don't put it on his head and he begins to dance around. It's a tool that Joseph is using. Just like the table they're writing on isn't a magic table. They're not using magic ink or a magic pen. But in order to best see the words as they appear on the seer stone, Joseph Smith is employing this method of using a hat. Now, the fact that he used two separate devices is something that Emma had talked about. Now, the first that my husband translated was translated by the use of the Urim and Thummim, or spectacles, or interpreters. And that was the part that Martin Harris lost. I think Emma was always a little bitter about that because Emma was the chief scribe for those 116 pages that were stolen. And her months-long work on this is just gone. That's another story, but I think even later in life when Emma's reflecting on this, she feels very poignantly about the time she spent. After that, he used a small stone, not exactly black, but was rather dark in color. So we have from our witnesses now these two separate devices that were used in the translation, which actually matches up to exactly what the Book of Mormon told us. There were going to be two separate devices. Martin Harris, who served as a scribe for mostly the lost portion, but also for some of that latter, said the stones were white like polished marble with a few gray streaks. I never dared look into them by placing them in the hat because Moses said that no man could see God and live. And beside, we had a command to let no man look into them except by the command of God, lest anyone should look aught and perish. He later told Edward Stevenson, who would later become a member of the 70, that the seer stones rested in the bottom of the hat. The prophet would read sentence by sentence as Martin would write, as Martin wrote. And so we have these multiple independent sources. Some early sources like Joseph Knight, who's writing his account in the 1830s. Some much later in the 1870s or 1860s. They don't know of each other, right? Martin Harris isn't reading Joseph Knight's history that wasn't found by the time that he's writing this. He's reflecting something very similar as an independent witness. Again, Martin Harris, by the aid of the seer stone, sentences would appear and were read to the prophet and written by Martin. And when finished, he would say, written. And if correctly written, that sentence would disappear and another would appear in its place. But if not written correctly, it would remain until it was corrected. So here's another artist who's attempting to do a more literal depiction of the translation. But again, none of this is really accurate either. I mean, I doubt Joseph went to all of the effort of covering up the plates only to leave like a fourth of it just open so everyone can see. The brown floppy farmer hat that we always see Joseph with, those hats don't even exist yet. They invent them later. I mean, we always picture Joseph with the brown floppy hat, but really they wore top hats. Those are the hats they wore until the 1840s. And so, but Emma serving as a scribe. Here's an image of that seer stone that's in the possession of the church. This is in the First Presidency's vault when I worked at the Joseph Smith papers. This was one of the requests that we made on Documents Volume 1 as we were talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon and the revelations that were received through these seer stones. We asked if there could be access granted to get an image of it, and there's that image, which again we knew the church had because Wilford Woodruff had told everyone that he'd consecrated on the altar of the Manti Temple. Just another artist depiction. You can see why, though, an artist might be hesitant to try to depict exactly how the translation occurred. If you didn't have the backstory that I just gave you here, you might not have any idea, like, what is going on here, right? Did Joseph eat some bad meat for breakfast? Is he about to be sick? What is going on? And so, in part, it takes time for art to evolve because the artist has to take into account the expectations of the viewer. Here's another image, which might be a little bit more easily understood, where the artist is trying to be a little bit more accurate, but even then, again, taking liberties, artistic liberties, to try to convey the message that they want to convey. One of the sources I'd like to share with you is kind of fun. You probably didn't know that you tune into this broadcast tonight and get to hear some anti-Mormon stuff, but this is the earliest antagonistic account of Joseph Smith and the gold plates that we have. If you look at the date over there on the far left side of the screen, it's August 11th, 1829. This is from the Palmyra Freeman. The Palmyra Freeman was the other newspaper in town, right? So Egbert Grandin ran the Wayne Sentinel, that's the newspaper, and then his office eventually did publish the Book of Mormon. But if you know this history, they go to Grandin, and Grandin at first not only says he won't publish it, he actually tries to enlist Martin Harris's friends to prevent them from publishing it. So they go to the other printer in town. They go to Jonathan Hadley. Well, Hadley is a big-time political and economic rival, as you might imagine, of Grandin. They are different parties, politics. They attack one another constantly in their newspapers, and Joseph proposes that Hadley attempts to publish this. Hadley doesn't have quite the printing operation that Grandin does. So he sends them up to his friend, Thurlow Weed, who'll later become a big-time mover and shaker in the Republican Party, actually. Thurlow Weed will be an advisor to William Seward and then Abraham Lincoln. But Weed also declines to publish it. They find another publisher up in Rochester who says they will, and they come back down, and they're able to convince Grandin at that point to publish it. But when Jonathan Hadley, the editor of this Palmyra Freeman, when he finds out that it's not his buddy who's going to be getting the $3,000, which, to give you an idea of how much that is, the average American made somewhere around $300 a year at the time. Joseph Smith's 14-acre farm with a house and an outbuilding on it in Harmony was worth $200. The cost of printing the Book of Mormon is 15 times Joseph Smith's entire value if he owned his whole farm, which of course he doesn't. One of the cool parts about the earliest antagonistic sources, like this one, is they don't know that there's going to be a church. They don't know that there's going to be thousands and then tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Mormons. In 1829, there's like 5 people that believe Joseph Smith outside his family, and one of them's Martin Harris. So it's like, once in a while. And so the response from Jonathan Hadley is angry, and it's loaded with all kind of sarcasm. But he's also recounting the events as Joseph told him. He can't get this account from anyone else because no one else has published anything on it. This article is being published before the first word of the Book of Mormon has even been typeset. All they know is that Joseph has said, I have this book, and now he's going to angrily denounce it. Listen to what some of the things he has to say. The greatest piece of superstition that's ever come within the sphere of our knowledge is one that has for some time past and still occupies the attention, I might have this a little bigger, blown up, there we go, of a few superstitious and bigoted individuals in this quarter. The term bigoted in the 19th century meant uneducated. I mean, it means that now, but it only meant that really. It's generally known and spoken of as the Golden Bible. Its proselytes give the following account of it. In the fall of 1827, a person by the name of Joseph Smith of Manchester, Ontario County, reported that he'd been visited in a dream by the Spirit of the Almighty, and informed that in a certain hill in that town was deposited this Golden Bible, containing an ancient record of divine nature and origin. After having been thrice thus visited, and notice he says here, as he states, you can tell that Hadley doesn't want you to think he believes this story. The Bible is found together with a huge pair of spectacles. Notice the terminology that Hadley's using. He's using that same terminology to describe the seer stones that Joseph himself is using in his earliest history. I mean, how's he doing so far on the story? He even knows that the angel came 3 times. Part of the reason why it's interesting to read these earliest antagonistic accounts is because Hadley doesn't feel like he needs to make a character assassination on Joseph Smith. He doesn't feel the need to. He feels like he's already got this wrapped up. He says he saw an angel, folks, and we're done, right? I mean, if any of you at the conclusion of this broadcast were to walk outside to get something from your car, and someone walked up to you and said, "Hey, I just saw an angel," your first response would be, "No, you didn't. Thanks, and please, step away." And we're Latter-day Saints. We literally believe in the ministering of angels. And if someone told us they saw an angel, we'd say, "I don't think so," right? For Hadley, he doesn't think he needs to embellish the story. He says he saw an angel, folks. He says there's gold plates buried in his yard, right? He'll go on to explain how Joseph describes the translation. It is said that the plates, the leaves of the Bible are plates of gold, about 8 inches long, 6 wide, and 1/8 of an inch thick, on which are engraven characters or hieroglyphics. There's only one person who gives us those dimensions of the plates. Lots of people try to give dimensions. Lucy Mack Smith tries to, Martin Harris does. The only one who gives us those dimensions is actually Joseph later. On which were engraved characters or hieroglyphics. By placing the spectacles into a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, again, I don't believe this is just what he said, interpret these characters. Now, he goes on to tell the whole Martin Harris story of taking the characters to the east to Professor Mitchell. One thing I'll leave you with, though, that's very interesting is, this is very fuzzy, unfortunately. Let me go back here. It might even be easier to read on this. It's just not a very good copy. You can tell the incredulous nature of Hadley. Now, it appears not a little strange there should have been deposited in this Western world and in the secluded town of Manchester, too, a record of this description. And still more so that a person like this Smith, notice what he puts there, very illiterate, should have been gifted by inspiration to find and interpret it. For Hadley, he doesn't have a Book of Mormon manuscript in front of him. He has the well-known Joseph Smith, who he knows is not educated, claiming that this book is equal to the Bible. And so he completely dismisses it. Early antagonists dismiss the Book of Mormon because there's no possible way it could have been produced. But once there is a Book of Mormon, once people are bearing testimony of it and believing because of it, well, then the story's going to change. Again, in the church's newspaper, they're going to explain that it was translated by the gift and power of God through the pair of interpreters or spectacles. And it's here in this January 1833 Evening and Morning Star, that they appear to first start to use the term Urim and Thummim to apply to any seer stone. I always thought growing up that, one of the stones was named Urim and this one was named Thummim, and that's why it was Urim and Thummim. But the reality is, Joseph uses this term Urim and Thummim to describe any seer stone. That's something that we actually all know. We just don't know that we know it. If I asked you, what is the place that God resides like? You would say a great Urim and Thummim, but not the ones that were found in the box with the plates. What will each of us get when we go to the celestial kingdom? Our own Urim and Thummim, but not the ones that were found in the box with the plates, right? What will this earth be like in its glorified and celestialized state? A great Urim and Thummim. Again, that terminology is being used by Joseph throughout his life as a kind of general explanation of holy seer stones, using that biblical term. It is sometimes troubling for people to think about the translation of the Book of Mormon this way, that God had words appear on the stone and that Joseph read them off. Yet, all of us have embraced a very similar miracle with the Liahona. There was also written upon them new writing, which was plain to be read, which did give us understanding concerning the ways of the Lord. And it was written and changed from time to time, according to the faith and diligence that we gave unto it. And thus we see by small means the Lord can bring about great things. Hopefully you don't confuse a lack of familiarity of a thing with that thing being wrong. The fact that Nephi and his family found a brass ball in the middle of the wilderness, out in the middle of nowhere. We don't have any idea where it came from. And that on a daily basis, it seems, the words that were written on this ball changed to help them know where they were supposed to go. That has never caused any of us, at least not me, even the slightest second of wondering, wait a minute, that's really weird. In fact, I've thought it's one of the great miracles of the early Book of Mormon. And that's really not that much different than the way that David Whitmer is going to describe this translation as well. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face into the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling a parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to all vocabulary as his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear in its place. And then David Whitmer gives a similar testimony that Joseph Knight did. Joseph Knight said, "So we see it was marvelous." Because anyone can dictate a book. People dictate books all the time. But not anyone can make words appear on a stone. That's a miracle from God. Thus, the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God and not by any power of man. Those who knew how the Book of Mormon was translated, or at least understood it in this way, they didn't find themselves having to try to believe in spite of the fact that Joseph used these sacred stones prepared by God. In fact, it was part of the miracle to them. They believed because God miraculously both provided these stones and then provided the means for the translation. Obviously, there are multiple places you can read about this. Elder Nelson quotes David Whitmer here, he was Elder Nelson at the time. He's President Nelson now. In 1993 in the Ensign, Elder Maxwell in 1997 talked about the seer stones, but it's still something that's been less familiar to us, and that's the reason why the church put out the Gospel Topics essay on the Book of Mormon translation, where you can read these things we've talked about tonight and the sources behind them. So I am going to stop so we can do some question and answer, but I want to bear my testimony by going back to what Elder and then President Nelson had to say. And that is a reminder that the great worth of the Book of Mormon lies not in its miraculous translation, wondrous as it was, nor in its stories that we read to our children. The great worth of the Book of Mormon is another testament of Jesus Christ. I know that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. And as a scholar who has examined the history surrounding it, and I've examined these, the papers and writings, sermons, journals, letters, revelations of Joseph Smith, as my job on a daily basis for more than the past decade and a half, I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. And I know that more now studying those sources than I did before. And so I hope that all of you can have the Spirit speak the same thing to you. And I'll turn it over now to questions.
All right. Brother Dirkmaat, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for spending your evening with us. Anyone who would like, please put questions in the through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom, and I will pose them to the good professor. And I will start with my question while we're waiting for those to come in, and that is how many records of people besides Joseph do we have of them seeing, hefting, or in some way experiencing the plates over the course of the time that Joseph had them?
That's a great question. We have quite a few. I mean, obviously we have the 8 witnesses who have this physical representation of the plates where they're going to lift it, look through it. You also have other people who see it and others who both feel it but don't see it. So for instance, Emma Smith feels the plates underneath their covering. She can feel the metal sides of it. She knows how heavy it is because it's sitting there on the table. But she says, I never thought it was appropriate for me to look at it. I mean, the amazing restraint that she had is incredible. You have other people that are pretty antagonistic to Joseph Smith, like Isaac Hale, who lifts the box. Isaac Hale is Emma's father, who's already not terribly happy that Joseph ran off and married his daughter against his consent. But when he comes back down to live on next to the Isaac Hale property, Isaac Hale gets to lift the box that the plates are in. He can feel it, that it weighs 60 or 70 pounds. He can hear the metal moving back and forth inside, even though he isn't able to see it. Josiah Stoll will also see the plates as Joseph hands them through a window at one point. The covering on them will slip off and he'll see them. So we have multiple people who either see or interact with them. And then, of course, you have the people who interact with them miraculously, like Mary Whitmer is going to have the angel of the Lord show them to her. The three witnesses that are going to have them shown to them. So I don't know that I have a definitive count, especially because, later on, there are other accounts that kind of filter out of people seeing the plates from pretty reputable sources. Brigham Young in the Utah era will be talking about the Apostle John Page and say that he saw the gold plates. I don't know about that story, but I know that Brigham Young certainly thought that he saw the plates, and so maybe he did, and that's a story that I don't know about. But I think one of the great aspects of the witnesses of the gold plates is that God prepared for both possible criticisms. When you think of how people would dismiss the fact that Joseph had gold plates, there's two ways. One, what's clear to historians is that Joseph certainly seems to think that he's been called by God. All of his writing, all of his life seems to reflect that Joseph really believes he's called by God. Non-Latter-day Saint historians are not going to say, oh, Joseph, simply made all this up, because there's too much evidence to the contrary. He really seems to believe he saw God. Now, to most historians who, frankly, they can't take a position on God, and someone would rather take a very negative position if they did, they would simply say, well, I'm sure he thought he saw, God, right? Similar to the three witness experience. The way that people would try to dismiss the three witness experience is, well, it's a vision. So I don't know if those guys were drinking, the wild turkey and then, went out, stumbled out into the woods and sure they all thought they saw an angel, even though it was on two different visionary experiences and at two different times. And yeah, but, throw that aside. Sure, they can still be honest. They just thought they saw it and they were wrong. Well, what do you do with the eight witness experience, where the eight witnesses physically experience? There's no miraculous aspect of this at all. They lift, they feel, they heft. Well, so someone might dismiss that, as some non-Latter-day Saint critics have tried to. Well, I'm sure Joseph had something. Yeah, he obviously had plates. People said that he did, but they just weren't really from God. And so you actually have these two experiences actually work together. Joseph has something. And in fact, non-Latter-day Saint historians who deal with the translation of the Book of Mormon today, they also admit that Joseph had something. There are just too many sources that say that he had it, including antagonistic ones who hate him, like Isaac Hale. And then it's the three witness experience that say, not only does he have something, that something is from God. They work together to say there is really plates, and those plates really are from God.
Wow, thank you. Next question from one of our viewers. Did Joseph always need to use the stones to translate?
This is one of the more common questions, and I don't want to say misconceptions, because again, I don't know exactly how every word of the Book of Mormon was translated. I'm not a seer. I'm not even an elders court president. I don't have any keys at all. I have no ability to speak for God. I'm only speaking as a historian. We don't have any sources in which someone says, or Joseph says, that he's translating the Book of Mormon without using seer stones. Joseph says, I translated through the medium of the Urim and Thummim. I translated by means of the Urim and Thummim. All of the witnesses say he translates using the stones, plural, or a single stone. Generally, where that confusion comes from is a much later source. In 1871, Orson Pratt is actually speaking at a School of the Prophets meeting in Salt Lake City. And they're discussing various things. And Orson Pratt mentions that he had asked Joseph Smith, obviously many years earlier, this is now 45 years earlier at least, he asked Joseph Smith why, if he had used the seer stones to translate the Book of Mormon, he hadn't used the seer stones to translate the Bible. And he says Joseph told him that he didn't need to use the stones anymore. And so that's become a general understanding of many Latter-day Saints. It's easy for them to conceive of, well, Joseph needed the stones at first, but then eventually he didn't need them. But that reference to him not needing them is actually to the Bible translation, which is several years later, 3 years later before it's finished. Clearly, he uses them to receive revelations more often before the Book of Mormon translation is done. But we know D&C 34, for instance, is a revelation that's received through the seer stone, and that's in late 1830, so well after the Book of Mormon's been published. I don't know that there's a cut and dried way of saying when he started and when he stopped using them. He seems to more regularly receive revelation simply through inspiration or through a vision after the church is founded. But he doesn't eschew the idea of seer stones either. He seems to use them to see Fox's the martyrs in Fox's Book of the Martyrs in the late 1830s. He shows them to Wilford Woodruff, and at least Wilford Woodruff thinks that that's how he's translating the Book of Abraham, is using the seer stone. So at least with the Book of Mormon translation, we don't have a source that says I got to the point where I stopped using the stones. For the Bible, yes.
Interesting. Thank you. Next question is, given all of your work on the Joseph Smith Papers project and all of the new sources that you have become acquainted with, what has been the most interesting, important, or faith-promoting, like, new fact or new piece of evidence that you have learned through this process? Or a couple, if
pass. I mean, it's so hard to point them out. One thing that I think became very clear as you studied more and more of Joseph's private writings was how sincerely he felt towards other people. Now, Joseph was a passionate guy. I mean, he would get angry. I mean, one of the things that people, when the Joseph Smith Papers first published Joseph's journal, one of his early journals, we actually got some angry emails and letters from people that they were mad that we didn't cut out portions of the journal, in particular the portion of the journal where Joseph Smith gets in a fist fight with his younger brother, William Smith. Some people thought that we should have edited that out, but Joseph writes about it in his journal because he's so mad that William Smith essentially sucker punches him, as younger brothers are wont to do, right? And but you certainly see his humanity, right? But one of the things that you start to really feel is just how much Joseph Smith loves other people. Some of the newest documents that came out are the Council of 50 Minutes. That's one of the volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers, and I worked on that volume. And these contain sermons that Joseph gave to the Council of 50 that no one knew about before. And the primary topic of many of them is just loving other people. At one point, Joseph makes a huge point of saying that we need to love people who believe differently than us. That if I know a man is susceptible of being my friend, and I have done everything I can to convince him of the truth, and he still is inclined in his darkness, yet he would still be my friend, even as if he had embraced the truth. Joseph is a lover of people, and the reality of his desire to elevate others around him is really clear in the things that he writes. I don't know that I can point to a single instance. I mean, the translation of the Book of Mormon was a big one. I mean, some of these sources, the first time they'd really been collated and put together and put out like this by the church. Many of the section headings that were changed in the Doctrine and Covenants in the 2013 edition came directly out of the Joseph Smith Papers research. But I think for me, it's more about seeing Joseph as this person who is clearly not the deranged individual that antagonists would want people to believe. We're Joseph, some duplicitous, selfish, self-aggrandizing person trying to get rich quick off of the backs of others. You wouldn't see his almost desperate desire to forgive other people, to the point where, as a historian, when you're reading things, because you know the end from the beginning, you shout at the pages, Joseph, not him. He ends up being even worse. You know what I mean? But I really feel like that's something that came through to me. I know people will say things. I hear people say it all the time. You know, if you study too much church history, well, then you'll lose your testimony. And I just have to say unequivocally, I reject that in its totality. When people say things like, oh, if only you knew what I know, then you wouldn't believe. I don't know who that person is, but I don't know very many people who are going to have known as many of these sources that I've looked at. And it's not because I'm special or I'm smart. It's because it's been my job for a decade and a half, right? And I'm certain that Joseph Smith's a prophet. And as I read the documents that he wrote, as the letters that he wrote, the revelations, I have the Spirit bear witness to me that he's a prophet of God. And so, I mean, I hope that people listening, I know that there's all kinds of things people say, and people will say, you know, if only you knew what I know, then you wouldn't believe. Well, there are people who know a lot more than whoever that person is, and they believe. You know, I don't know a tenth of what Richard Bushman knows, and he believes. So I think it's important to recognize that someone's authority, when they're claiming that they know something, can only go so far. Only the Holy Spirit can ultimately tell us what's true.
Wow. Well, I'm tempted to end the fireside on that note because that was so beautiful. But we have one more question from the audience, and that's about Emma. Seeing that Emma was the scribe for Joseph for the lost pages from Martin, have you done any research on what Emma's reaction was to the lost pages? What her feelings were?
You know what's really interesting? The lost 116 pages are things that no one really wants to talk about. You can tell that it was a tragedy in the early church. Surprisingly, Martin Harris doesn't ever reference it in all of his reminiscent accounts. He never looks back and says, you know, the time that I broke my covenant with God and lost on it. He doesn't ever bring it up. It is just painted right over, right? The way we might with some of our own family histories. And Emma doesn't ever really mention it except in passing when she's talking about the timeline of translation. Lucy Mack Smith is the one who gives us the best indication of Emma's fervency on this. She's the one who tells us that, so Joseph gives those pages to Martin, he takes them up to Palmyra, and he doesn't come back. He's supposed to come right back. But Joseph's a little bit distracted because the day after Martin Harris leaves with those pages, Emma goes into labor, and her baby, unfortunately, dies in childbirth. And not only does their first and only child die at the time, Emma nearly dies herself. And Lucy Mack Smith tells us that Joseph is at Emma's side for weeks trying to nurse her back to health, probably fearful that any moment she could die. And so in that moment, Joseph, while certainly somewhere in his mind is the 116 pages, Lucy Mack Smith tells us that it's actually Emma that prevails upon Joseph and says, you need to go find out where the pages are. And I think that's because she was fully invested in this too. She had, for all intents and purposes, given up her lifestyle and her family, and you know, things are not going well at the Isaac Hale farm at the moment, and she feels that same burning desire to see the book come forward and to see this record. And again, she knows much of it because she's been writing it down as Joseph gave it, the miraculous things that come off his lips. So that's the only real indication we get. Emma never goes on a rant saying that Martin Harris, if only we had the Book of Lehi. So,
well, thank you. I can't thank you enough for being here this evening, for your years of dedication to this important effort of uncovering and teaching the history of the Restoration, and most of all, thank you for your testimony this evening, especially your testimony of that the more time you spent in the sources, the stronger your testimony of Joseph Smith has become.
thank you, President.
We just really appreciate you being with us. And I believe Brother Smart, you have the closing prayer.
Our dear kind Heavenly Father, we are so very grateful for this opportunity. We're grateful for Brother Dirkmaat and all his work. We're grateful for all those saints present before us on the other side of the veil who have done so much, sacrificed so much to bring this truth to light. Please bless all of us that we can take this book seriously, that those of us who came with various testimonies, that we can try a little bit harder and work a little bit more to find this truth that we believe to be true, and share it with those around us. We are again grateful for this gospel and for all of those who are helping it go forward. Bless us this night, and we